I'm Dr. Octavia Cox and welcome to my channel where I do all things classic literature. Today I'm going to analyse a literary device which is incredibly common. You might well have used it 10 times this week without necessarily being aware of it. That is litotes. In this video I will provide an introduction to the rhetorical figure of speech litotes, starting by providing a literary definition and explaining the meaning of litotes with some everyday kind of common speech examples. And then I'm going to move on to show litotes in action in classic literature using examples from Jane Austen and William Shakespeare, some more comic in tone and others slightly more serious. What is litotes? Litotes derives from the Greek for plain, small, simple, meagre. Litotes is a rhetorical term, a figure of speech that is a type of meiosis. Meiosis, deriving from the Greek for belittling or lessening, is a classical term for understatement. So litotes then is a kind of understatement. In particular, litotes is a figure of speech, as I've said, very common in everyday speech, as well as a literary technique, in which an affirmative is expressed as a negation of the contrary. So let me just say that again. Litotes is a way of describing something, not in the affirmative, but as a negation of the contrary. Often, although not always, using a double negative. It's an example of understatement because you deny the negation rather than straightforwardly stating the affirmative. So, for example, you might say not bad. So you're negating the contrary. Not bad to mean or to imply good. Or not ill to mean well, or not ugly to mean beautiful, and so on. If someone says, for example, well, he's not shy, what they might really mean is that he's an insufferable, arrogant what's-it. The Oxford Dictionary of Literary Terms defines litotes as a figure of speech by which an affirmation is made indirectly by denying its opposite, usually with the effect of understatement. Common examples are no mean feat and not averse to a drink. This figure is not uncommon in all kinds of writing, and as I've said, speech as well. Not uncommon. Of course, that is an example of litotes itself. In the example, no mean feat, mean is used in the sense of lowly, small, ignoble. So no mean feat, no lowly, small, ignoble feat then suggests that you have in fact achieved something extraordinary. So, oh, that was no mean feat. You know, you've climbed Mount Everest, that was no mean feat. Saying not averse to a drink might mean that a person will have a drink. So if someone offers a drink, they might say, oh, I'm not averse to a drink, as in, yeah, fine, I'll have one. Or, depending on the context, it might even imply that, in fact, a person is far too partial to drinking. If you said, oh, she's not averse to a drink, you might even be implying that she's an alcoholic or something. Litotes may be common in all kinds of writing, but authors can use it for very different effects. It can be ironic, it can be euphemistic, it can be evasive. It's a versatile device. And before I go into the literary examples, I think it's worth stating that there is something very different in terms of tone in using litotes rather than simply stating an affirmative. Logically, it might be true that a negative and a negative equal a positive. And I remember at school I was always told, don't use double negatives, that's bad writing, you should never use a double negative. But so while logically it might be true that a negative and a negative equal a positive, but in terms of conveying meaning through tone, through the way that you express something, there is a significant difference, a significant variation between stating two negatives and stating a positive in terms of creating an effect. Those two things, even if they are logically apparently the same, aren't necessarily the same in terms of tone and what the speaker or what the author is trying to convey. Take, for instance, the litotic phrase, not unhappy. If you were to knock off the two negatives, so you knock off the not and you knock off the un, then you would be left with happy. So in theory, not unhappy and happy are equivalent. But the implication of what you intend to convey is very different if you say, I'm happy, and if you say, I'm not unhappy. Just by couching a phrase using litotic construction, an author draws the reader's attention to that description and asks the reader to think about the real implications of what are being said. So it's asking the reader to think, why didn't you just state that in the affirmative? Why did you express this description in this slightly convoluted way? What are you really getting at here? To get to the literary examples then, which I hope you are not reluctant to hear, starting with William Shakespeare's play Hamlet. A very clear example of litotes comes in Claudius's opening speech to the court in Act 1, Scene 2. So Claudius is the new king of Denmark, and in the speech he refers to Fortinbras, who is the Prince of Norway. Denmark and Norway are neighbouring, competing Scandinavian countries, and Fortinbras wants to take back some of his land, what he considers to be some of his land, which the old dead king had seized. So Claudius says, young Fortinbras, holding a weak supposal, so a weak estimate of our worth, or thinking by our late dear brother's death, so the old king who took the land, our state to be disjointed and out of frame. So Fortinbras thinks that the state is disjointed and out of frame. That means in a state of confusion. Colleagued with the dream of his advantage, so together with the dream of his advantage, he hath not failed to pester us with message. So that's the litotes there. He hath not failed to pester us with message. Importing, that means concerning, the surrender of those lands lost by his father. He hath not failed. In other words, he has succeeded in pestering Claudius with messages. But what couching it as litotes does in not failed is, first, it suggests, perhaps in a rather light-hearted tone, that Claudius might rather have wished that Fortinbras had failed in his pestering. But secondly, and more figuratively and more seriously, it shows that Fortinbras is not a person who fails to act when he thinks it is to his advantage. So, colleagued with the dream of his advantage, he hath not failed. So when he thinks something's to his advantage, he does not fail to act. Fortinbras does not fail to act when the moment is ripe, which, of course, foreshadows events later in the play. Moving on to an example more comic in tone, Jane Austen's novel Pride and Prejudice. So Elizabeth is contemplating visiting her newly married friend Charlotte and her unforgettable husband Mr. Collins at Hunsford Parsonage. This is when Lizzie is still back at home in Longbourn, and the narrative reads, absence had increased her desire of seeing Charlotte again and weakened her disgust of Mr. Collins. There was a novelty in the scheme, and as with such a mother and such uncompanionable sisters, so Jane Bennet at this point in the novel is away from Longbourn. So with such a mother and such uncompanionable sisters, home could not be faultless. A little change was not unwelcome for its own sake. So there are two examples of litotes here, not faultless and not unwelcome. In using litotes, Jane Austen's narrative voice implies that home is beginning to grate on Lizzie, but she's being polite about it. So the euphemistic not faultless particularly emphasises the faults. If you take away the not and the less, you are still left with fault. And additionally, in having the text show that Lizzie finds being with her family not faultless, the groundwork is being laid for Mr. Darcy's later criticisms of her family's faults, that in fact, although Lizzie trots about it, she is aware of it too, that his recognition that her family has faults is justified. In his long letter to her after the fallout from his first disastrous proposal, Darcy will write of the total want of propriety so frequently, so almost uniformly betrayed by herself, that's Mrs. Bennet, by your 3 younger sisters, and occasionally even by your father. And Darcy in the letter particularly refers to the defects of your nearest relations. Although Lizzie's litotic, euphemistic phrasing is far more polite than Mr. Darcy's, in recognising that her family is not faultless, readers see that actually on this point they agree, even though Lizzie puts it more politely than Darcy does. So the other litotic phrase then, a little change was not unwelcome for its own sake. By introducing the negative, by couching it in the negative, the text shifts the focus onto Lizzie wanting to escape from Longbourn, basically, rather than suggesting that she is particularly keen on, that she actually welcomes going to Hunsford. Now, considering a less humorous tone, Jane Austen's novel Persuasion. Towards the end of the novel, Captain Wentworth had given Anne Elliot a letter declaring his love for her. This is the moment that they meet again for the first time after that letter scene. So, this is in fact Charles Musgrove and Anne Elliot, they were on Union Street when a quicker step behind, a something of familiar sound gave her 2 moments' preparation for the sight of Captain Wentworth. He joined them, but as if irresolute whether to join or to pass on, said nothing, only looked. Anne could command herself enough to receive that look, and not repulsively. Repulse, not in our more sort of modern meaning, modern understanding of the word repulse, to mean kind of to feel intense disgust or aversion, but meaning to reject, refuse or rebuff a person or his or her advances, comments, etc. That's from the Oxford English Dictionary. So in this crucial moment, and the union between the heroine and the hero in a novel is supposed to be the grand climax of the novel. So why does Jane Austen then choose litotes, choose understatement at what is supposed to be this moment of great climax? Austen could have written and received that look with alacrity, with joy, with love, with eagerness, happily, gladly, delightedly. There are many, many, many other phrases, sort of affirmative phrases that Austen could have used, positive phrases that she could have used, but she went instead with the litotic not repulsively. Why might this be? Perhaps because the tone of the novel Persuasion is sombre and reflective, and what not repulsively does is it reminds readers of the past, which both Anne Elliot and Captain Wentworth have been constrained by through the whole novel. It reminds readers that Anne had repulsed Wentworth in the past when she broke off their engagement 8.5 years previously. This moment is adeptly constructed by Austen just in this 2-word Litotes, because it boils down to a very kind of condensed nub, to the essence, the heart of the matter of the novel. It implies how much these two characters continue to be shaped, to be coloured, to be formed by the past. That they continue to be shaped by Anne's previous repulsing of Wentworth and Wentworth's resentment at Anne's repulsing of him. So even in this moment that is supposed to be the climax, this happy moment, and still conditioned by the past. But now it is a reversal of the past, not repulsively. I'm going to close by considering William Shakespeare's beautiful poem, Sonnet 116. This is the poem that opens with the lines, "Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments," which has a particularly gorgeous example, I think, of Litotes in it. "Love's not time's fool, though rosy lips and cheeks within his bending sickle's compass come." Shakespeare uses Litotes here to compare and contrast the two clauses, so the two parts of this couplet. Love is not time's fool, but rosy lips and cheeks, that is, youth and beauty, are time's fool. So he's contrasting those two. Fool here meaning to be ridiculed or tricked or duped or gulled, to be fooled, but also to be subordinate or subservient to. And love is not time's subordinate. Love is not under time's spell, but youth and beauty must succumb to time's sickle, that is, death. In the use of Litotes here, Shakespeare implies that love is exceptional, that everything else is time's fool. Everything else must succumb to time's ravages, to death, but not love. That it is unusual for something to exist outside of time, but love does. And the Litotes highlights that unusualness. I do hope you've enjoyed this quick introduction to Litotes, a very versatile literary device used in many different ways by authors in order to draw the reader's attention to the tone of a description, and thus make the reader think about why the author or speaker has understated matters. The reader or listener is forced to consider what was being held back. Why wasn't this just stated in the affirmative? Why the negation of the contrary? Thank you very much indeed for watching. Remember, if you like what I do here on my channel where I analyse classic literature, then do subscribe. And if you have liked the video, then do please press the thumbs up button. It helps me out in YouTube's algorithm. And if you have any of your own, then do share your litotic examples, your examples of Litotes below.